I'm Heather Chaplin. I'm Director of Journalism and Design at the New School, and before that I was a reporter and writer for about 20 years. First, I want to thank you all for coming. I know the competition is tough here, and it's the end of the day, so I'm impressed that you're all up and about and not taking breaks in your hotel rooms. What we're going to talk about today is something I've been thinking of as Crisis 2.0. So we're all here in Austin to talk about how journalism works online. And we're all doing this work because the internet, among other things, of course, came along and uprooted the way journalism had been done for the last 100 years, which sent us spinning off into crisis. We all know the basics. In the last 10 years or so, we've lost half our newsroom staffs, seen ad revenues drop by about 2/3, and more than 1,000 local newspapers have been closed, combined, or torn apart. We found ourselves fighting for eyeballs in an attention economy that seems to feed on people's worst and most extreme impulses, and scrambling to understand fake news and misinformation and the intense lack of trust that seems to surround us. I want to suggest, though, that there's something changing in the air, something we can all feel. I've come to think of it as Crisis 2.0, and make no mistake, it is an existential crisis. We cannot close our eyes to the fact that there is currently underway an intentional, politically motivated attempt to delegitimize the press, and we have not begun to digest how different of a kind of problem that is. The disruption that was the internet, it shook up all of media and publishing. If newspapers had collapsed then, it would have almost been a side effect. It would have been us getting left behind. But now, in what I'm, in a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek manner, calling Crisis 2.0, journalism itself is the target. The conditions are being set not for the end of the newspaper business, but for the destruction of the very notion of a free press. Undoubtedly, all of these things are related. It turns out the internet was a kind of vector. Once our business model became to target and mine people's attention, which is how things work online, a blind race to the bottom seems to have ensued. It turns out that what keeps people's attention doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what's true. It turns out that what's most compelling is conflict, extremism, and outrage, and finding others who share your prejudices, whatever they might be. So for every Black Lives Matter, we seem to have a dozen right-wing extremist groups. We're getting used to the waves of hysteria passing around the world and causing not only intense tribalization and ill will, but bloodshed. These are ethnic Rohingyas in Myanmar being shot. It turns out tearing barriers down to publishing led not so much to a democratization as a mobification. And yes, with the best intentions in the world, we have been part of it. We've contributed to the hysteria and the polarization. It's like a catch-22. In trying to win eyeballs, even for a good cause, for journalism, we've become caught in what Tristan Harris calls the race to the bottom of the brainstem. And it turns out that people's lizard's brains are not always fond of people who insist on reality. We were doing what we had to survive, but without meaning to, we've helped lay the groundwork for our own destruction. We've helped fuel the model where grabbing people's attention at all costs is what matters most. Now, I don't say any of this for us to beat ourselves up. I don't know what else we could have done. The reason I raise the point is to try and show that we're caught in a vicious cycle. And if we keep just doing what we've been doing, we'll just keep going round and round and round until we've spun ourselves right out of existence. So people have dubbed these times the post-truth era. And it's true, things have gotten pretty weird. Our president says his inauguration was the biggest ever. That's his on the left compared to Obama's on the right. And then he orders the photos to be cropped to cut out all the empty spaces. Or, hey, if you were watching Fox News the day Mueller handed out the indictments, you would have learned a lot about the new hamburger emoji coming out. I don't know how many people remember, they barely covered it. It's not that ideological faux journalism is new, or that presidents haven't lied through their teeth before. Rather, it's that more and more people seem not to care whether something is true or not. Now, a lot of people frame this as a trust problem. People don't trust the media, they say, but I think it's actually much more than that. This is from Timothy Snyder in the Washington Post a little while ago. It says, democracy depends upon a certain idea of truth, not the babble of our impulses, but an independent reality visible to all citizens. Authoritarianism rises when this goal is openly abandoned and people conflate the truth with what they want to hear. Then begins a politics of spectacle where the best liars with the biggest megaphones win. And so that thing I said about journalism before sort of unintentionally giving rise to an economy that serves our worst instincts, well, we know that other people have gotten in on the action too, but for far more nefarious reasons. I mean, every era has bad actors. It has people eager to exploit other people for their own benefits, to cheat, who are willing to violate normal ethical modes. But boy, what an opportunity the internet gives them. It's a breeding ground for fascists. And that's what we're seeing, and it's totally classic. It's straight from the fascist playbook. I'm paraphrasing Yale philosopher and author of How Propaganda Works, Jason Stanley here, but the strategy is you hammer away at the facts, you challenge their legitimacy over and over and over until people just finally throw up their hands and say, well, there's no way of knowing. But the problem is that without facts to ground us, without shared truth to bind us to one another, you really end up with a kind of anarchy the center cannot hold. And in times of intense confusion and fear, people are easily preyed upon. This is how fascism works. It's all about the amygdala. It preys on people's most primal emotions, their angers, their disappointments, their insecurities, and also their longing to belong, to be part of something bigger, which then causes them to turn in hope of solace to the very fear-mongers who are fanning their anxieties. Goebbels said the Nazis would have won if they'd had TV. Imagine what he would have thought of the social web. So I'm not about to suggest that we stop fighting for people's attention. That would be madness. Obviously, we have to be out there working our hardest to keep journalism in the flow of things. In fact, let me take a minute to just stop and salute everybody here who are working tirelessly on this. I have been part of the fight myself. I know how hard it is and sometimes how thankless. My point is that there are other things that we must absolutely be doing as well. We need to build what I've come to think of as a journalism of resilience. All right, we've all heard the word resilience, but what does it actually mean? Resilience is a word that comes from the Latin. It means to spring back. It means the ability to withstand or recover from trauma. It's holding on to your essential shape, even if you get bent out of shape. So it's the opposite of something brittle, which breaks when you strike it. Take the human body. It's an amazingly resilient system. If I get a piece of sand in my eye, the eyeball doesn't drop out, it waters and flushes away the sand. If I breathe dust, I produce mucus, and so on up to more serious threats. If I get an infection, my body responds with discomfort to signal to me that something is wrong. My white blood cell count rises, and I get a fever which does its best to kill the infection. And no, it's obviously not foolproof. People die from accidents and illnesses all the time, and there is no antibody for, say, a bullet. But the fight the body puts up to stay alive, the resourcefulness, the resilience, that's the thing. And what always amazes me about this, the invasion of antigens and the way antibodies rise in their defense, which is what you're seeing up here, is that the particular antibodies you need at any given time, they're not just sitting around in your body waiting. Rather, your body has the tools and processes waiting to make the right antibodies depending on the nature of the threat. It's a system designed to be resilient. So what I'm trying to say is that the cure lies within us if we have the will and the imagination to develop it. Or here's another way to think about it. Have you ever heard of a rhizome? It's an underground root system that's essentially decentralized. There's no central starting place. Plants spring up all over, but all growing out of this one root system. So if you hack off a flower in one place, it doesn't kill the whole thing. Another will spring up somewhere else. So I wonder, could we think of journalism as less of the tree? Because as strong and beautiful as trees are, if you cut one down, it's dead. Could we think of ourselves as more of a rhizome, where if one growth dies, the rest are still there and more will come up? It's a more resilient system. Oops, sorry. This is another image of a rhizome system, a man-made one. This is from an architecture project called Graffiti Rhizome. The author was looking at the contexts that allow graffiti to flourish. And what I like so much about this image is that it's not made up of lots of discrete pieces of graffiti, but rather looking at graffiti as a whole, as a system that exists within its environment. So I found myself thinking, what if something like that was part of our mental model of what journalism is? What if we could think of ourselves as not only members of the particular news outlet where we work, but as part of a whole, as something more like the green in the picture above? Because the thing is, journalism is not the New York Times or BuzzFeed or the Miami Herald or whatever. When you strip everything down to its essential function, journalism is a system for collecting, synthesizing, verifying, and distributing the news. Everything else is just form. There have been times when journalism was people reciting the news from memory in the market square in ancient Rome, or in the 18th century in this country, pub owners kept books at the end of their bars for visitors to come and write down what they'd seen in their travels. So in a way, yes, I'm suggesting that we think of journalism more as a weed than an oak tree. Can we hone our ability to pop out in unexpected places wherever we can, not just in gardens, but in the cracks between sidewalks? So what might some examples of this look like? Well, I'm not going to say that I have the answers, but let me throw out some examples. So first of all, we should not forget some things that already seem old now in internet years, but things like the collaborations between the New York Times and the Guardian and other papers behind Panama Papers and WikiLeaks, or an organization like ProPublica, which we now think of as like an establishment organization, but was really quite radical in that it was built on the idea of collaborations between organizations that a generation ago would have been unheard of. Sharing resources is a great way to build general resiliency while still being good for the individual outlets. But let me also throw out a few more radical ideas. I'm part of an experiment right now where we're working with a couple of community organizers in different cities who are identifying potential leaders in their neighborhoods, and we're giving those folks some basic journalism training so that they can fulfill the function of journalists in their own neighborhoods. Then we're working with professional outlets in the area and connecting them to each other. The idea is, can we cultivate informal networks of journalism and see what new kinds of relationships can spring up between the informal and the formal networks? I'm fascinated by this. I think about the untapped potential of UPS drivers or folks in barbershops or nail salons or local coffee shops, people who are trusted in their communities and fulfill some of the function journalists do of spreading important information. I'm not saying these people should replace professional journalists. I'm saying we should see where else in the larger system of the journalist function could be fulfilled. Or some other examples that I'm not involved with but that have inspired me recently. Sarah Alvarez's work, she's a former civil rights lawyer who now has something in Detroit called Outlier Media. She does serious reporting on, say, housing or other local issues and then distributes the work to people via text. Or Angela Ford, who I just met, who runs something called the Obsidian Collection Archives, which is trying to address the issue that many historically black newspapers are not digitally archived, which means they don't appear in internet searches, which at first you don't think is that important, but then you realize important African-American news and stories will not be part of the larger cultural awareness. So again, I'm not saying that any of these examples are the answer or should replace professional journalism. They're just examples of seeing journalism as a bigger system that can produce lots of different offshoots. Because I don't mean to sound like an alarmist, but we can't afford to wait and see if our remaining local newspapers survive, or survive in a robust enough way to meaningfully fulfill their journalistic function. And that's an important point, and I want to hone out that distinction. Many people say this is a golden age of journalism, that there's so much great work happening that we can't even keep track of it, and I think this is true. But the thing is, if that great work doesn't have impact, because the context around it is such that people have ceased to believe that facts matter, or they just don't see it in the first place because they're plugged into Fox News, then we're not fulfilling our function no matter how much good work we produce. So I show these examples not as the answers, but as examples of a less centralized, more rhizome-like model of journalism. And it requires a different mindset, I know. And we've gotten a lot better at seeing other news organizations not just as competitors, but as potential collaborators. But I want to suggest that we take that idea a bit further. What happens if we keep zooming out our focus? We've pulled back from just individual news organizations to the system of journalism itself. What happens if we pull back again and begin to see journalism as just one system embedded in a bigger system, the system of democracy? That crazy idea that the people should rule themselves. Our role in this system is to handle news. while all around us, other parts of the system do what they were put in place to do. The justice system ensures that all citizens are treated equally. Public education provides critical thinking skills. Our markets keep an equitable flow of income going to everyone. Our voting laws ensure that it's as easy as possible for all people to vote. Oh wait, no, that's not right actually. Our public school systems are barely providing literacy. About 1 in 7 American adults struggle to read children's books. In higher ed, students last year graduated with an average of about $39,000 in debt. The top 1% of American households today controls more than the bottom 90% combined. Our justice system puts African Americans in prison at 5 times the rate of whites, and voting suppression and intimidation is everywhere. Purges to voting rolls in Indiana, Texas repeatedly found guilty of discriminatory practices, gerrymandering everywhere, turning Democratic votes meaningless. And Republicans are currently trying to pass a constitutional amendment that would require voters show a state-issued photo ID at the polls, which research, as well as common sense, tells us suppresses minority votes. Do you ever stop and marvel how everything seems to be in crisis all at once? Or as an African-American friend said to me recently, now everyone in America has a glimpse of what it's like to be black? It's not a coincidence, of course. In the system of democratic society, all the parts are totally interdependent. What all of this tells us is that the problem, it turns out, is not that journalism is in crisis. The problem is that democracy is in crisis. The whole system is out of whack. And while I know it might feel overwhelming at first to expand the boundaries of this crisis, I mean, we're already working as hard as we can to stay afloat. The thing is, you have to know the real nature of the problem you're dealing with to have any hope of developing an effective strategy for change. The other thing, and I think this is incredibly powerful and inspiring, is that if you're willing to expand the boundaries of your problem, you simultaneously expand the possibilities for fixes. Fixes that don't just come from newsrooms or groups that work with newsrooms. Suddenly, we may find strategic work to be done in law or technology. We may ask ourselves, how do we influence cultural norms? The key is to lift our heads up and look around. Alone, I don't know that we can survive this. But if, even occasionally, we lift our heads up and stop staring at the narrowest definition of our problem, the one directly in front of us, the grindstone we have our nose to, we may see that we're not alone. What if we thought of ourselves not only as journalists, but as stakeholders in the larger problem of building and maintaining a resilient democratic system? What if we realized that our struggles, financially, existentially, were part of a much larger struggle? If we opened our eyes and looked around, not for the edges of our own field, but for allies, wherever they might be. Maybe our allies are not just other news organizations, but people in education, voter rights, income equality, justice. And to be clear, I am not saying that we become those people. I am not saying we take sides in partisan arguments. Rather, I'm suggesting that equal participation in a democracy is not a left-wing principle. It's a democratic principle. Our allies should be liberal and conservative alike. The more the merrier. The organizing principle of this alliance is wanting to build a resilient democracy and not slide away into authoritarianism. The challenge, of course, will be to hold on to our integrity and our purpose even as we stretch ourselves into new shapes. But if we're truly resilient, we'll be able to do this. That's the point of resiliency, to hold on to the essence of your shape even as you get bent out of shape. Because like it or not, we're not just journalists anymore. We're enemies of the people, which we all know really means enemies of authoritarianism. The reality is, whether we meant it or not when we first got into this business, now, just by the act of being a journalist, we have become part of a larger pro-democracy coalition. I suggest that we own it. And I just want to close with this great quote. That's the good thing about everything being so fucked up. No matter where you look, there's great work to be done. Thank you. So I intentionally kept the talk short, partly because I don't like to sit and listen to somebody talk for an hour. But I also thought it would be interesting to hear what other people have to say or what other thoughts, and if there's a conversation to have, and if not, we can all leave early and hit the bar. Oh, and I was supposed to say that the hashtag is ONA 18 disruption. Yeah, I was going to suggest that, but then I sort of felt bad 'cause it's the end of the day and maybe people are tired. But if people are up for it, that is what I was going to think too, is if everybody at their own table just wants to talk for a minute amongst themselves and maybe think of an example in your own local community where you can imagine, again, no one's going to hold this to you, but just thinking wild thoughts. Who are some other people? Maybe it's specific people, maybe it's other institutions that maybe could be allies, and what kinds of relationships might you build? Do people just want to talk amongst themselves for about 5 minutes? And then each table can report back. Everybody gets up and leaves. So just take another minute or two, and then we can all report back. So let's start to wrap up our conversations, if people feel like this is a good time to stop. Does any table want to, guys, let's come back into one group and start to wrap up our conversations. Does any one table want to start telling us a little bit what you talked about or what arose, anything interesting, anything good, anything not so good?
So you raised a very good point that the issue is democracy itself. You know, I very much like the idea of journalists banding together and seeing ourselves as a larger organism. But we also talked about the fact that the population has just withdrawn into its own selfish bubble. So who is it we're trying to influence? You know, and I'm just wondering, you know, no matter what we exert or advocate for, you know, people are concerned with themselves, maybe their families. They congregate in dark corners of the internet with like-minded people who just reinforce those views. And, you know, that's it. They don't want to hear not from us, not from anybody. And I'm just wondering, is that purely a function of the internet and what it's allowed them to be? Or has it always been this way and it's just more exaggerated now? But I think the large part of this problem is also the population.
Great, thank you so much. Does anybody else want to jump in and either respond to that or share what you talked about at your table? Yeah, Peggy. Why don't you say who you are and what?
Peggy Holman, Journalism That Matters. I want to respond to that because I think journalists have tremendous amount of agency around the issue that you're talking about. How stories are told makes a huge difference on whether people step in or step out. And when there's a wonderful piece called Complexifying the Narratives by Amanda Ripley that was published, commissioned by the Solutions Journalism Network, published just recently, that looks at some of the data underneath that. Because when stories are framed in a way that people check out, because it's like they see no role for themselves, no way they can be involved. When we write stories and frame them in ways that people see how they can step in, people get involved.
Great, thank you. Do any other tables want to jump in and say what you ended up talking about? Great, I think they need you at the mic for recording purposes. Sorry about that. It's a little awkward, I know.
Yeah. Hey, my name's Elijah. I'm an editor at Quartz. So my take on the presentation was like, it sounds great in theory, right? And we can like set aside the audience, in fact, because I think in large part you're talking not so much about the audience here as much as you're talking about other institutions, I guess, and organizations and structures. And I don't see a practical way to do things differently than we already are. I mean, I think like we're already typically working with or at least supporting the aspects of these institutions and organizations that are pro-democracy. And so I don't know what forming a coalition would mean. So I guess that was our main reaction. I mean, it was just the two of us, but yeah.
Did other people have similar thoughts or want to chime in on that? On feeling like you're just stuck, like there isn't room for movement.
Hello. So I don't necessarily have an answer, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot this summer. Oh, sorry, I'm Alex Laughlin. I'm with BuzzFeed News. My partner is a PhD candidate, and he's studying political science, and he focuses a lot on democracy theory and the ways that democracies come together and fall apart over time. And so we traveled to Georgia for a weekend, and what he noticed was that I hadn't been back to this town in 4 years, and I walked down the street and I could recognize and say hi to lots of people on the street and like walk into businesses and know people. And he said that like that is a sense of like social capital and buy-in to a community that is missing from the way that we live our lives today, when we have Blue Apron and Amazon and like we aren't going to grocery stores or going to church, and we're just like getting in our cars or like plugging it into our podcasts and like living our lives on a highly individual level. Now, that doesn't solve the question necessarily, or offer any answers for journalism, but I think it's something that like is helpful to know that this is a thing that is an issue across multiple disciplines, and I think it's affecting a lot more industries than just ours.
Yeah, please. Sorry. No, please.
I think it depends where you...
Let's say who you
Oh,
are,
I'm sorry.
please.
I'm Josephine Bennett with Georgia Public Broadcasting. I want to know what part of Georgia you were in afterwards. Athens. Okay, that's one of the cool places. But we have reporters all around the state, and a lot of them have been in their communities for a long time, so they actually are in the grocery store. They do go to concerts and do things and are active in their communities, and that gives you kind of that capital that you talk about. I think it's more challenging for organizations like a Washington Post or a New York Times or BuzzFeed because people don't know you. And I think that's an advantage we have. They can come up to us, they can give feedback, good and bad, but they know us. So in some ways it makes our job a little easier. And I do feel like we're actually trusted within the world that we inhabit.
Great, thank you. I just want to say something directly to your comment. I think a lot of people are feeling very pessimistic right now, often myself included. And I don't think I or anybody here has the answer for how to break out of it, but I do, two things I want to say is, one, I do often think the first step is to open your mind to other possibilities, even if you don't know what those possibilities are. That if you can believe that there are other ways of doing things and put in the imaginative work, it is possible to get there. I would just say, I don't know how many people, I've been sort of around on the digital transformation front for almost 10 years now, and at the beginning, people thought the idea of like people who wrote for the web and who wrote for print sitting in the same room together was like lunacy, or the idea of like audience engagement, which is now, it's already passé, it's so accepted, was like a completely radical idea that people thought you were just nuts to be talking about, well, what would it mean to listen to the audience and to build two-way relationships? So I feel like people always think nothing is possible, and then some breakthrough happens, and then it just becomes normal. So I guess what I'm saying is, I don't know, and I'm afraid. I think, I was raised in part by Holocaust survivors, and so my alarm bells are going off an awful lot these days. I think history does not always move in a straight line forward, and a lot is at stake. But it is possible for things to get better. Things get worse, they get better, they get worse. It's how are we going to handle the situation that we're in, and if we don't believe that it's possible, and if we stop looking around for allies or for solutions or things that we can do differently, we might as well just throw in the towel now. Believe me, I wish I had a better answer than that. Oh. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Does anybody else, just to go back, I know looked like there were some good conversations going. Does anybody else want to, yeah, please, just come up and say who you are and...
Hey, I'm Sean Sullivan, work at USA Today. I was guilty of dragging some of my weird linked data, et cetera, ideas into the conversation. And so I do think there's some practical ways that we can do this. I won't get into all of that right now. But maybe we can share some of the information that we do verify and things like that to help advance general truth and et cetera. And two challenges were brought up when we were talking that through. One was competition, et cetera. And I think that could be handled by publishing and making money off of what you rightfully worked to have, and then figure out which bits you can share and when to the rest of the community. And the second was, how do we work with partners, organizations, in higher ed, et cetera, who work on a different time scale? And
Yeah.
one thing that we were discussing was that perhaps they could be important gatekeepers and arbiters of that information after it leaves the competitive sphere. And so I know New York Times and others have explored this before, open knowledge graphs and et cetera. Anyway, I just want to throw that out there as one way that maybe we can link up and help each other.
Great, thanks so much.
Hi, I'm John Brooks. I'm an editor at KQED. We're a public media company in San Francisco. Thanks, this is really a great discussion, and we are actually having this discussion to a certain extent currently. There's one school of thought that is articulating it as our journalism is causing despair in people because the stories are so bad, and that we need to do something to empower people more to take action. And then there's another school of thought that is kind of in reaction to that, which is, we're journalists and we're causing despair because the news is bad, but the best thing we can do is to just tell the truth, give people all the facts, put them in context, and do all the things that journalists do. Just kind of maybe a little bit of evidence for that last one is I do think of the ProPublica story where they just went into the detention where the children were being held, and it was just like 5 minutes of children crying, and that was so powerful, and I do think that probably actually had an effect on policy, right? And so that was just a piece of great journalism that really did impact something. But another thing I have been doing, and I've been thinking this myself, and just as a thought of experiment, I have been asking people, how would we cover something like Kristallnacht?
I see one of my former students is here, so she might have, I always ask that question to my
Really?
classes, yeah.
No kidding. Because, I just personally, as a citizen, the thing with the kids really strained my ability to remain nominally objective. Talking about 5-year-olds being...
I think that some stories do not have two sides.
Right. So, this is as crazy as, in my lifetime that I've ever seen it. So we are kind of in uncharted territory, and it's really an open question. We think about it all the time, like, how do we respond to this? We've never had a president of the United States, call people enemies of the people and call out specific journalists, right, like at rallies. So I appreciate the discussion, and of course, I don't have any answers. So,
Thank you so much, thank you.
Hi, my name is Melissa Evans, and I work for the Long Beach Post in Long Beach, and I also teach part-time at Cal State Long Beach. And I didn't think of this when we were talking at the table, but one thing that I'm really excited about, we're one meeting in, so it's very early in the process, but we, a team from our publication met with the geography department at Cal State Long Beach, and they have a master's program there, and they do mapping for
Mapping?
their GIS master's program. And so we thought, we have all this data on pedestrian collisions, and we thought they could help us map stuff, and maybe some of the students could get some experience. We're at this meeting, and these geography students have, we tell them about this data, and they're looking at us with these big eyes like, how did you get that? And we're like, we started explaining the PRA process to them, and they were like taking furious notes. Like they have no idea how to get this information from government agencies. They were like, do you have an MOU? You know, they start throwing out all these academic, you know, things, and it's like, no, you're a resident. You can get this. Anyone can. So they were using, for their master's projects, they were using 2010 census data to teach these students. And so I'm really excited about this because I think we can lend a lot of expertise on how to get data that they can actually use that's more relevant.
Well, and I think
they can
sorry.
help us.
No,
you
and
know?
I think also what I heard you say, the point that most people don't realize what they have a right to ask for
Right.
is so huge. You know, another thing we do at J&D is we're in the process of working with some community colleges, doing sort of the way that we teach journalism, but I often think that the journalism education is in some ways a Trojan horse, that I know that all of the students are not going to become professional journalists, but I still think teaching people to understand what real evidence is and what a fact is, and that you as a citizen of the country have the right to like go into your congressperson's room and ask some questions, that's empowering stuff. So I am in the process of trying to gear up how can we get journalism education out in a broader way, again, as almost a Trojan horse to sort of educate people in this reality-based, empowered way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other tables want to report on what they said, or at this point, does anybody just have any questions or thoughts? I think a lot of really interesting things have come up. As a teacher, I'm used to long periods of silence, so I will wait you out. There we go.
Hi, I'm Nick Gersey with the Denver Post, and I think the question I have is that there's a lot of news organizations spread out across the country that are doing really, really, really good work trying to get people to talk to one another. I'm thinking of in Colorado, our public radio station has their like Breaking Bread series where they bring people together from like different partisan leanings, and they have meals and they talk through things. I know that you brought up Sarah Alvarez's Outlier Media. There's the Harkin group. How do we sustain that work, which I think is what you're suggesting we need to do more of, but also too, how do we systematize it to reach more people? Because we can, convince every journalist can go out and convince a single person that journalists are like champions of democracy and we're not, enemies of the people. But how do we do that on a broad, systematic scale? And I think that's the question I'm leaving with right now.
So what comes to my mind is that I am definitely talking a long game here. I think that the problems that we're facing as journalists embedded in the larger system of democracy is going to require work in areas like the education system and the justice system and income inequality. Because if we don't work on those things simultaneously, we're never going to do those things. So in my work, I don't so much focus on what's a solution that we could do that would see more readers tomorrow? Not that that isn't incredibly important work, but I particularly am interested in, while we have that short-term strategies and visions going, how do we learn to be better long-term thinkers? I don't think journalism industry has tended to be very strategic long-term thinkers. If you go to any major corporation, they're planning way out there. They're doing future scenario plannings. They're thinking about what happens if there's race riots, how do I profit off this, da-da-da-da-da. We just don't tend to do that kind of thinking. So again, I just want to be really careful. I'm not saying the sort of, I got to get more readers now, we have to do this tomorrow. We can't stop thinking about that, but we have to develop this ability to really think in terms of a long game if we don't want to end up in an authoritarian state, which I'm sorry, but I think if you look around the world, not just in our own country, that is on the cards. We have to take a broader perspective. We have to see the connection between the rate of imprisonment for African Americans and the collapsing business model for journalists. It's all part of the same thing. And I know that can feel like, well, that's so unpractical and it's so big. But again, I just want to say the minute you expand the problem space, you expand the possibility space. So what does it mean to work with a justice reformer? I don't know exactly, but can we at least start with the conceptual leap of seeing them as our partners and our allies? And then what happens from there?
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Kelly Root. I work at the Detroit News. And your comment just now about the push and pull between the push and pull between the now and the long term is hugely part of what I do every day. We're in a JOA with the Free Press, probably one of the last, if not the last, in the United States, so we're in a really unique position. But when you talk about long-term planning and thinking broadly, our bosses are thinking every day about what's making money and what's not.
Totally.
And, you know, those of us who are still in the legacy newsrooms are faced with this constantly. So this is a fascinating topic for me, and thinking about the future and, you know, what do you see in your line of study will be the funding model? I mean, I see so many nonprofits here, so many foundations, so many collaborations. All these are great, encouraging things, but on a practical level, you know, I don't know if my newsroom is going to be open in another year. So, you know, how do you see the practical funding of journalism in the next 10 years?
I think that's a very tough problem, and I would probably mostly want to point you to people who have studied that more. I mean, one of the reasons that I have gotten so interested in informal networks is almost as like, okay, let's say your paper collapses. Like, how do we make sure news and information keeps distributing? So in a way, I find myself thinking in a very worst case scenario way. Now, the issue of funding gets very, very tricky. I mean, I find myself having a lot of thoughts that I understand are not necessarily realistic now, but I say them again as a way of just maybe opening a new way of thinking, or even tapping into something that tends to be sort of verboten. But I found myself thinking a lot. I don't know how much of you saw that, you know, New Jersey, the local government just put it together a pot of $5 million for local journalism innovation. And that was pretty controversial because a lot of people, a lot of Americans, let me say, are really freaked out by the idea of government investment in news. But, you know, in Europe, the average is something about the taxes go, I think it's $85 per person for news. Here it's $3 per person. And, you know, we bailed out the banks, right? Where the fuck is like the money for newspapers to get back on their feet for the next 10 years? What, we're not important? I get it. I know why, especially now that we have he who cannot be named in office, like, we wouldn't really want that happening. I don't think these things are easy, but like, come on, like, Britain has done pretty well, and everybody, when you get a TV, you pay a certain amount of money, and that pays for the BBC. They're currently looking at a tax on Google and Facebook to fund the BBC. Why are we letting these giant tech companies run rampant over the universe and not realizing their public utilities, that we've created the content that keeps them alive? Why don't we get something back from that? I get it, it's controversial, but I think we need to be, everything has upsides and downsides. You just have to decide which is worse and which is better. I need to ask you to go to the microphone just because I think they're recording.
Hi, I'm Sean Walsh. I'm with The Statesman here in Austin. I'm a reporter. I was just curious about your thoughts on the Boston Globe-led editorial movement, a month ago or so.
I don't think I know about it.
Oh, it's where every...
I was out of the country most of the summer.
Okay,
and
gotcha.
offline, which was beautiful. So fill me in.
The Globe started this, actually, our editorial page editor is here. So if I get something wrong, let me know. But the Globe invited newsrooms across the country to write editorials, defending the freedom of the press in this day and age, and hundreds signed up, and Trump didn't like it.
He didn't like it. I think that's beautiful. I was really struck by Denver Post. I think that kind of spirit that generated that is exactly what we have to keep cultivating, and what are next steps beyond that. But I think it makes my heart swell.
Hi, my name is Michelle. I'm with Quanta Magazine, producing physics and bio news. So I also have an education background as well, and I studied a lot of different types of freeform education, and I really latched onto this kind of design thinking, which has a really investigative approach to learning, and then from there I got into journalism, where I am now, and I just see this huge link in the way we learn. I just feel like an investigative approach is vital to learning, and I'm thinking about like why that type of curriculum isn't in children's education, because it really builds community and empathy, and why aren't we seeing that in young education?
Why are newspapers failing? I mean, the other thing I would just throw out there is, as reporters, we're always trained to like follow the money, like that'll take you to the cause. I also think the other crucial question is always ask, who benefits? Right? Like, who benefits from people not being educated, or who benefits from there not being a free press? Like, right? So I think if you want to really ask that question, you have to think about who benefits and why are the reasons that we don't have a thriving public education system. Because, I mean, to say you're going to have a democracy where everybody is going to vote and participate, but we're not going to educate people or give them critical thinking skills so they can defend themselves against manipulation, that's what leads to mob rule. The great liberal reformers of the 18th and 19th, I'm just freestyling now, but the great liberal reformers of the 18th and 19th century were really split about democracy. Like, a lot of people that you would admire for everything else they did were like, no way, right? Because the French Revolution was like, it's bad when people who just get worked up into a frenzy. The only reason democracy can work is when people have things like a free press, and when they have an education system, and when those things crumble, you start to get what we're having now. So who benefits and who loses? And that always has to be the question at the end of your inquiry. Well, 3 minutes left. Should we hit the bar? Great, thank you everybody so much for coming.